This video is going to cover the use of the exposure and brightness sliders in our image adjustments tab within Capture One. Now, Capture One has two ways of brightening or darkening an image, and often people get them confused because the terms are used interchangeably with each other. So when we refer to brightening an image, actually what we sometimes mean is we're going to increase the exposure of the raw file. When we refer to darkening the image, we don't necessarily mean we're using the brightness slider. We could mean that we're going to reduce exposure. So in this session, we're going to go in depth into what exposure does, what brightness does, what that does to the histogram of your image, and in which scenarios the one is going to be better than the other to use. So here's a standard image. It's actually slightly underexposed as a base image, and we can see that because it's generally dark. We can also see that through the histogram. So the histogram is a very important tool when we're editing images within Capture One, because this gives us a non-biased view of the image. And by that, what I mean is, it doesn't matter how bright my screen is, I can increase the brightness of my screen or decrease it, it's going to make no difference to the histogram display, which is showing me on a scale of from completely black to completely white, so 0 to 255, left to right, where the data in the image sits. So even if I have my display frankly off, so I couldn't even see the picture, I'd be able to see from the histogram that this image is particularly underexposed. So by that we mean most of the data sits in the lower midtones or in the shadows. So with data in the lower midtones and the shadows and nothing in our highlights and our upper midtones, we've got a lot of room to move that data along. Now, depending on the dynamic range in your camera, some cameras are more capable of recovering shadow detail, some are more capable of recovering highlight detail, but certainly when shooting RAW, we've got a little bit more latitude than we would do in a standard JPEG to move that exposure either left or right by a couple of stops. So let's have a look at this image and let's just pull that exposure up. So with our exposure slider here, let's imagine we had exposed this one stop more. Now the exposure slider literally represents stops. So if I put in 1.0 on our exposure slider, that is the equivalent of doubling the light in this image. So we've moved the image up by one stop. That's the equivalent of changing by one stop as if we'd had taken it like that at the point of capture. And it's the equivalent of moving this histogram across by an entire stop. So one doubling of light. If we were to increase this exposure by 2 stops, well, I could just type in 2 into exposure. And we haven't doubled the light, remember, because these are stops. So exposure by 1 stop is a doubling of the light. And exposure by 2 stops is a quadrupling of the light, because we've doubled the double of the light. So we're now at 4 times brighter than the original image. Now the original image had a lot of data in this lower quarter of the histogram, so in the shadows and the lower midtones. The new version, with a 2-stop increase in exposure, has a lot more data that's been shifted up into the upper midtones and even some into the highlights range on the shot. So in this case, if we're talking about recovering a photo that has been under or overexposed, exposure is the perfect slider for us because it's literally picking up that histogram and it's moving it to the right or it's moving it to the left. Every single piece of that data gets shifted along by the amount that we dial in this exposure tab. So if I move it up by, let's even go up to 3 stops, so 8 times more light, 8 times brighter. We still don't necessarily have anything too overexposed, but certainly we've moved most of the data now from being down here in the shadows to up here in the highlights. So in this way, if we are literally dealing with an image which is under or overexposed, we can use our exposure slider to correct for that within reason. So many cameras are capable of recovering 2 to 3 stops easily. Once you go above that, then you're going to start to struggle. So that makes sense. That's quite easy. So it's very simple. If an image is underexposed, then we use the exposure slider and we make everything brighter. Well, it's not that simple, unfortunately, because in this case, for example, let's go back to how we started. I've moved the shadows and the lower midtones up because I didn't have any risk of damaging anything up here. There was no data in the highlights or the upper midtone section of the histogram. It didn't make any difference by moving this exposure along, and as I do it you can actually see the chart of that histogram and all the data moving along. I can move it right the way up until the first bit of data hits that right hand side, the wall as I call it. Nothing here is overexposed. We've got all the data here in our histogram within our 0 to 255 range, and actually we could now play with it. We could play with contrast, saturation and whatever, because we're starting from a good base. But many photos don't work that way, so let's go to another scene. this one here. So this is in Bordeaux. And in this scene, absolutely the same. We've got a load of stuff here, which is in the lower in the shadows in the histogram. So a lot of dark areas, a lot of deep, low midtones. But we've also got this little spike here. And that spike is telling us that there are things in this image which are either close to or are overexposed. Now, Capture One actually comes with a very handy tool for measuring whether things are overexposed, which is the exposure warning. But we're going to make one change to your Capture One setup that will hopefully help you with it. So the exposure warning, let's just turn it on as default. I'm going to go to my preferences, and your preferences for your exposure warning are going to be set by default to about 250. Let's turn on that warning, and what it does is it gives us a nice red mask, and that red mask tells us anywhere in the picture where red, green or blue are clipping. And by clipping we mean that the data that was stored on that pixel was greater than the threshold that's set in our preferences. Now obviously on a histogram we go from 0 to 255, and we just saw in our preferences in Capture One that the default is to warn us at 250. Now personally, and this is a preference thing, I would rather it warn me when something hits 255, because at 254 I've still got data. At 253 I've still got data, 252 I've still got data. So it's wonderful that it gives me a warning that that area is approaching, but in reality I'm only actually worried about it if it has actually clipped. So the first thing I would do is go into preferences, and personally I set this to either 254 or 255, up to you. Now with our exposure warning on, we can see the areas that have definitely clipped. So these are areas that actually go off the edge of our histogram. In other words, their value in either red, green or blue, or a combination of them, has hit 255 or beyond. Now, if you look at the top of the screen, up here, just above my cursor, you'll see these four little numbers. So one is 0 in red, one is 30 to 31 in green, one is 126 to 127 in blue, and then we've got 33, 34 in grey. Those numbers are actually very important, and they're always up there. Whenever you're moving the mouse around on your screen, you're going to see those numbers rapidly change. They're referring to the amount of red, green and blue on the pixel that your mouse is currently over. So if I go to the blue area of the sky, we can see that there's no red in it, 0. There's a little bit of green, there's 31, and there's 126 of blue. So it's predominantly a blue colour with a little bit of green mixed in. The grey value gives us the overall average of that pixel. So in other words, in grayscale terms, from 0 to 255, how bright is that pixel? So unsurprisingly, let's just zoom in. I'm going to press the Z button on my keyboard just to draw a little marquee. So let's go into 100% here. And if I move my mouse over one of these highlighted areas, so let's pick on this area here. So we've got our red mask on it, and the red mask comes from our exposure warning tool up here. Let's turn that off, and we can see why it's saying it's overexposed, because it clearly is. Let's just turn that on again. Remember, it's just a mask. It's not telling us the image is red, it's just telling us there's a warning here because something underneath it has a problem. And now look at those numbers on the top. 255, 255, 255, 255. In other words, the pixel that my mouse is currently pointing at is overexposed on the red channel, overexposed on the green channel, overexposed on the blue channel, well actually one below, oh no, there we are, 255 again on the blue channel, and overall it is at 255 on our entire grayscale value in the histogram. So this is what we're using to measure whether we've pushed the image too far or pushed the histogram too far. And this is where the exposure and brightness tools are going to show us some quite dramatic differences. So with that in mind, and we've got our exposure warning set, let's have a look at the difference between two images and what the brightness versus exposure tool will do. Please don't get these confused with high dynamic range, because the high dynamic range is a way of tweaking each of these four sections in your histogram slightly differently. So we can pull down the very, very brightest parts of the image. We can pull down the highlights. We can pull up our shadows. And we can pull up the black areas of the image. Now what happens is, as you can see on the histogram, it's squashed everything into the middle. We've lost all contrast in the image, and by doing that recovery, effectively we lose contrast, and the contrast is what comes from a histogram which has got spikes in it. So if we see a histogram which has got some nice heavy data at the top end and heavy data at the bottom end, like here, then that gives us contrast. We've got detail in the highlights and detail in the shadows. We don't want to get rid of all that contrast, but we do want to be able to see more of what's in the shadows over here and over here, so left and right. without damaging the stuff that could potentially already be overexposed in the middle. Let's create a clone of this particular image. So this has been corrected in Keystone, but it hasn't had any other changes made to it, so all of my sliders are pretty much as they were, and the white balance is as shot. Let's choose this one, and I'm going to increase the brightness by 50%. Oh, sorry, by 50 on the slider, 50%. That number is actually very important, though, because this number is an arbitrary capture 1 number. So it goes from 0, plus 50, minus 50. It doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation to stops in the camera or anything like that, whereas exposure does. So in this case, I'm going to increase my brightness up to the maximum, 50. And now I'm going to give you a magic number, which is I'm going to clone this variant again. And with this one, I'm going to use exposure. Now, in my experience, and you can't measure this in terms of the highlights or the shadows, because we're going to see in a second why they behave differently. But if I look at the midtones, a 50 on the brightness scale is the equivalent of a 1.4 exposure change. So remember that number, because if I look here at the blue sky up here and here, these are very similar. So this is with brightness put up to maximum, and this is exposure to 1.4. And the same applies in the reverse. If I were to reduce the brightness down by minus 50, the exposure would shift to the equivalent of minus 1.4. And for the purposes of comparison, that's important because I want to make sure that we're not using one tool unfairly against the other. So in this example, we now have the original image, the same image where we've increased the brightness to its maximum, so 50 on that scale, and the same image where we haven't touched the brightness, but we've increased the exposure by 1.4 stops. So in these terms, we've got two equivalent images, and I can pull these two up together next to each other. I can't do a before and after because my before and after is literally going to go back to the raw. So we're going to go from brightness up to brightness down. This is more about comparing what the brightness tool does and what the exposure tool does. So there's our brightness on the left-hand side, and there's our exposure on the right-hand side. Both have been shifted by the same equivalent, but look how different the images are. Let's just zoom into one particular section. Let's go into the middle here by the flagpole. Let's get to 100. That looks pretty good. Okay. Hopefully this comes out on the video, but on the left-hand side, you will hopefully see that everything that was already a highlight hasn't been pushed to be too bright. And in fact, we can see this through the numbers. So let's look at the numbers up the top here on our cursor. On the left-hand side, this area of the window is at 255 on red, so absolutely it would generate an exposure warning for sure. So it's 255 on red, and it is, where are we? I've lost my numbers. 228 on green, 173 on blue, so overall 231 on the grayscale. Let's go to the same position, the exact same position, on our exposure adjusted image. So over here, 255 on red, 246 on green, 194 on blue, 243 overall on the grayscale. So it's increased by quite a significant amount the area that was already at risk of being overexposed. And the same can be said for here. So we can see in here on the brightness one, we've got a lot more texture in this stonework here underneath this statue, whereas on the one here on the right, we've lost a lot of that detail. So what's going on, and why would there be a difference if effectively we've moved them by roughly the same amount? Well, let's just zoom out completely. And overall, we can just turn on our exposure warnings, and we can see on the right-hand side, the one that's adjusted for exposure, we've got more warnings. They're bigger areas than on the left-hand side. So that's another confirmation that effectively that exposure change versus the brightness change has put more risk of overexposing our highlights. Now here's what's actually happening. Like we said earlier, I'm going to turn this exposure warning off. As I move our exposure up, the whole histogram, the entire thing, moves from left to right. So as I move it along, absolutely all the shadows start to move along, but so do the highlights. So we're dragging shadows that weren't even visible on the histogram before, and we're increasing some of the dynamic range in the lower parts of the tones. But we're pushing the areas that were already at risk of being overexposed off the end of the wall. It's like putting your histogram on a skateboard and sliding it left and right. The same would happen with if I moved it to the left and decreased our exposure. So let's decrease it. Let's move it down to the left. And absolutely all of our highlights have now come back. That's great. The camera actually had a lot of good dynamic range when it was recording this image. But look at what it's done to the shadows. My shadows have now gone flying off the left-hand side of the wall. And if we have a look at the whole image, I've lost all the data and all the detail in those shadows that are in the picture. So while it's great for moving an entire histogram from left to right, and if we use that example again like I just did earlier here with the ice block, if I need to move the entire histogram, then exposure is the right tool. But if I just want to squeeze the histogram a little bit further, then that's what the brightness slider does. And it's about the way that it ramps the change. So instead of picking up the histogram and physically moving the entire thing from left to right, the brightness slider squashes it. So if I move the brightness slider to the right, it's going to pick up that shadow and the low midtones and the upper midtones, and it's going to slowly move them and push them towards the end of the right-hand side of that histogram. But look, it's not letting anything go off the edge, because as it gets closer to this 255 value, the amount of the effect of brightness starts to taper off. So if you imagine it has 100% effect down here in the shadows, let's say 50 to 60% of the effect in the midtones, and it slowly gets down to having almost no effect at the top end of the image. Now obviously if you push it too far, it does have a small effect and it can risk a little bit of clipping, but nowhere near the same effect as what the exposure does to the same level. So our brightness slider is like a ramp. So instead of a skateboard moving your histogram from right to left, this is like a little fist that's sort of squeezing it and pushing it along the histogram, but keeping each of the other ends safe and secure. So as I pull my brightness down, the same would happen. So even though I'm pulling the brightness all the way down, I'm not losing too much shadow detail because it's not letting anything go off the end of the wall. Whereas if I do that with exposure, I lose a lot more detail out of here because I've pushed some of those tones way too far. They've gone beyond zero. So there's our difference in brightness and exposure. So in terms of practical uses, let's just go on to here so you can understand as well the clipping that's happening in the exposure. Because if I turn my exposure warning on, and this is something to understand when you're seeing some of these warnings, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pixel that the red mask is covering is overexposed in terms of it being beyond white. So when something goes beyond 255 in the histogram, typically we see it as it's blown out because it's gone bright white. Well, let's just turn our exposure warning on. This is a test card. Now that exposure warning, let's just make a point so you can see it nice and clearly. I'm going to change the color, which you can do as well, of the exposure warning to be magenta. So let's turn that on. And look what's happened. So to the human eye, this wouldn't make sense because clearly this red, this green, this blue aren't overexposed in that sense. They're not this color, they're not bright white, they're not overexposed in the traditional sense that we would view it. But actually, if I measure and look at the top of the cursor area up here, if I measure the amount of red that's in this line all the way along until when it gets up to the white area up here, it's a solid 255. And the same with the green. So let's go to green and we can watch those numbers at the top. Green, green, green. The red and the blue are slowly increasing as it gets closer and closer to white. But that green value is constantly 255. Same with the blue. So quite rightly, Capture One is turning around and saying when I turn the exposure warning on, all of this is a warning that it could be overexposed. And all it's telling us, like I said earlier, is one or more of the RGB channels has been clipped at 255. So the exposure warning, please read it with a pinch of salt because it's not necessarily telling you that something is bright white and overexposed in our traditional sense of how we look at things. What it's telling you is one or more of those channels is clipped. In other words, there could have been more data there could have been more red, but this is the maximum that the camera could record. So let's pick on an image here. Now this is a great example of where exposure is not going to help us, but brightness will. Because I want to bring up the detail on this floor here. But we can see this spike here on our histogram. That spike here on the right-hand side of the wall is telling us there's something that's really, really, really overexposed already. And we can all probably hazard a guess. I can turn on the exposure warning to help, but it's going to be this sunlight. So let me just turn onto a pointer, move my sunlight there, and yes, 255, 255, 255, 255. It is overexposed. It has clipped. It's beyond recovery in that sense. Let's try and pull the exposure down. Even with 3 stops under, 4 stops under, or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's technically darkened it, but there's no data in this area here. It is overexposed. So the worst thing I can do to bring up the content of this floor is to bring up this area here even brighter. That wouldn't make sense. We're going to make this even worse. So we've got 2 options. One is we could, of course, split these 2 out. So I could add a new layer. I could put a little handy gradient filter somewhere around there. Just press the shift key to keep it level. Let's see our mask. Okay. And we could independently pull up the exposure of the floor. And that's going to have a good effect for us. But I could have just done it with brightness, because what brightness is going to allow me to do is bring up the exposure of the floor and of this area here in the shadow without pushing this any further off the edge of the histogram than it was to start with. So overall on the picture, let's just pull brightness up. And we're seeing that we are brightening the overall image, but we're not ruining this area here any more than it was to start with. Because while it's pulled this up from the shadows on the left-hand side here, and it's pushed it into the lower midtones, what it hasn't done is push this spike here off the wall. So you might want to use them in combination. There's nothing wrong with having an overall brightening effect on the image. So maybe we pull that to, I don't know, 19 or 20, something like that. And we could also put on a gradient mask, and that gradient mask could sit just there. And with that gradient mask, we could pull up a little bit of exposure too. Whoops, wrong way around. Let's just invert that mask because we've done it the wrong way around. And pull up our exposure on the ground. Great, only by 2/3 of a stop. That's plenty. So we can use them in combination. A bit of brightness on the background and a bit of specific increase in exposure on the foreground. But overall, these 2 tools do very different things. The difference can be very subtle. If you look at it really closely, you can notice. But overall, you need to get the hang of using both of these, exposure and brightness, separately for separate reasons, depending on the content in the image. If all of the histogram can be moved to left and right without any effect of over or under exposing anything, then by all means use exposure on its own. But if you've got something that's on the right-hand side or the left-hand side that's at risk of being pushed off the wall, so overexposed or underexposed, any change in exposure that also includes that area of the image is going to push it out. So then you would be better off using the brightness slider instead, and it'll give you a much better effect.